Hi, my name is Dan Wotherspoon, and I headed Sunstone from 2001 to 2008. And I've been conducting this Why I Stay session from about 2011 forward. And at first today, I would like to pay a little more of a tribute to Toby Pingree, who we have here. There's a tradition at Sunstone to create fun covers with little things for those who've meant a lot to the organization. And that's the one for Toby. And we are going to have some slides of him through his life, just kind of traveling as I speak to him. Toby passed away this last February. And so I had usually always acknowledged him as the starter of this, but this is what's going here. I also want to thank Jeff Pingree for these pictures. Jeff is Toby's son. He's a filmmaker, and there's actually going to be a session on his film tomorrow morning. His film's called The Return of Elder Pingree. It played last year at the Symposium, and it's available to anybody who wants to click on it and watch it now. But Toby's part of the film, as well as an essential help with the finances. He was wonderful there. So. Toby was an incredibly active board chair and champion for Sunstone. He enlisted a tax attorney friend, and the two of them negotiated debts that the foundation had been burdened by for many, many years, ultimately reestablishing the foundation as the Sunstone Education Foundation. He met with our team weekly. He boosted our energy, always bringing something fun or some food or just little things, as well as keeping us on task. Then in 2003, he began talking about the need for more sessions at Sunstone that feature Latter-day Saints who through their lives have managed to face and wrestle. I don't know if you'd say successfully, but wrestle, at least in real wrestling, with all the challenges that come for curious-minded members. Toby and those who he hit up to participate are much like the guests on Krista Tippett's podcast, at least the ones whose spirituality and sensibilities about the world, God, the divine, anything like that, were formed within a faith tradition and active engagement with it. Krista describes them as people who say yes and. Yes, I've seen with clear eyes the harm, the damage, the insult that my religion has done for some people. I acknowledge it, I mourn it, I see that. But then comes the and I get up and I go to work. I roll up my sleeves and I do my part to try to get a better world going. I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing there, but Toby spoke at our first Why I Stay session, and I'm going to read a little bit or describe some things that are in that initial talk. After talking about his background in Mormonism, he says, "Despite my conformist establishment background, I have struggled with certain aspects of the faith of my fathers. The three I list below have been and continue to be troublesome for my faith." And the number one he lists here is the unequal treatment of God's children within the church. To give an example that I've told before, that just I don't know if I heard it from Toby himself, but I picked it up through the years, that he was called as a fairly young man to be a bishop. And this was well before 1978 and the revelation on it. And as the stake president called him, he says, "I just want to let you know that if a worthy young black man comes to me and asks for priesthood, I'm going to ordain him." And the bishop, or he said that the stake president thought about it for a minute, and he goes, "How about this? If you face that situation, give me a few weeks warning," meaning we'll quietly probably release you from your calling. But that's the kind of person Toby was. Second one was polygamy and how that struggled for him. He says, "My conviction is that the highest and loftiest relationship that can exist in this world or any other is created by our heavenly parents, as created by our heavenly parents, is between two loving spouses, united in their total commitment to make each other happy and to rear a family. And then third, that was especially troubling for him, was repression of independent thinking and study within the church. He quotes Hubie Brown, who expressed the desire to young people to preserve, then, the freedom of your mind in education and in religion, and be unafraid to express your thoughts and to insist upon your right to examine every proposition. He goes on and talks about why he stays. He has a sense that there was something unique about Joseph Smith that compels him. He talks about how he's been sustained throughout his life, that there's a genuine God in heaven. And then finally, the one I'm going to read is, I am Mormon to my bones. My ties to the restored church must be intertwined with my DNA. I am buoyed up whenever I gather with the saints, be it in a high priest group meeting or in the Andes, a testimony meeting in my home ward, or an open discussion group like Sunstone, where I learn from others and my voice is respectfully heard. The church provides me the opportunity to serve and to be served. Its repressive aspects are burdens I bear because I'm confident that those who run the institution are doing the best they can. I can best help the church I love by staying involved and letting my light be seen. That's who Toby Pingree was, and we just wanted to honor him today. So I think you can now tighten the camera in or whatever. That's the last of anybody. Nobody else is going to show slides today. I have the pleasure to introduce three wonderful people today who, I think I turned a page too soon. Who I turned to and, oh, here it is. Come on, man. Oh, you know what? I double printed a page. Oh, my heck. Okay. Oh, it's on the back of one of mine. I tried to uncollate, on your printer for this thing. I know a lot of you have been to Why I Stay before, and there's just a brief write-up. We used to have a lot longer one that was in the symposiums, in the programs. But I thought it would just be fun for you to hear what I sent to the beautiful people who are going to speak with us today about what Why I Stay is about, and just to kind of possibly gather some thoughts around. And who knows how they did, but they all told me it was a great experience to put this together. Why I Stay asks each speaker to share in a concise way some key reasons he or she stays engaged constructively in the church while being aware of its difficult history, certain cultural pressures and problems, theological remnants that no longer track with her or him, and how they have come to make that decision. What has been the internal calculus they have used, or the sources they draw on for spiritual strength? Perhaps it's spiritual experiences or a key moment that came along causing a shift or a big perspective that helped them see things more clearly. And if Why I Stay isn't the best approach to take, as it may never really be a super conscious choice on some folks, and for others, they may not have physically stayed within the congregation. So it says this session also welcomes stories and examples of how the speaker engages in their Mormon community's family and wider circle. What experiences, highlights, or practices have assisted him or her in successfully walking a faithful path among fellow saints who may or may not have been actively pursuing questions as vigorously as they are, as vigorously as they are, or who may seem somewhat confused, or these people, perhaps the speakers, who have been somewhat confused or even put off by particular people in their congregations. Above all, I hope they will share stories, moments, breakthroughs, as this was what we all are so hungry to hear about. I'm excited to introduce the three speakers we have today who will present stuff that's close to their heart. There's nothing more sacred than that. Our first person is Blaire Ostler. She is a philosopher who specializes in queer studies and is a leading voice at the intersection of queer, Mormon, and transhumanist thought. She is an author publishing her first book, who now has published her first book, Queer Mormon Theology, An Introduction. I had Blaire on my show. My podcast is called Latter-day Faith, just over a month ago, and we had an amazing discussion together. And I've had a lot of people write me and say that was very, very meaningful to them, the way she broadens Mormonism and the theology to show how embracing it really is, even though it often gets very narrowed down in the discourse. She is a board member of 3 wonderful organizations, the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and we've got a little card here to introduce them up here if you'd like, the Christian Transhumanist Association, as well as being on the board of Sunstone. So she is well enmeshed in our things here. We're excited, so we'll hear from her first. Jay Griffith, our second speaker, is an explorer of ideas and a facilitator of dialogue and relationships, and I mean extraordinarily gifted and committed to this. He co-founded and manages the monthly discussion groups Faith Again, as well as Think Again. Jay designs, writes, and he creates for food and for fun. I wasn't quite sure what that meant. I should have talked to him. His other passions include trail running, writing poetry, reading and listening to all kinds of topics, being outdoors and striving to be useful to God, nature, and fellow members of his species. He serves in the Latter-day Saint African Refugee Branch. He and his wife Jane are in close familial relationship with 3 grown children, 2 daughters-in-law, 2 grandchildren, 2 cats, 2 chickens, and 1 beloved dog. You will really enjoy meeting Jay. Kimberly Applewhite Teitter has a doctorate in okay, here it is. I'll just read it. I was trying to paraphrase a little bit here, but she's a licensed clinical psychologist practicing in Salt Lake City. The Salt Lake City area. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from New York University, a Master's of Science in School Psychology, and then a Doctorate of Psychology in School Clinical Child Psychology from a wonderful graduate school associated with Yeshua University in the Bronx, New York. She's worked in Counseling and Psychological Services Division at Brigham Young University before transitioning to her current role as a clinician and program coordinator of the dialectical behavior therapy team at the Utah Center for Evidence-Based Treatment in Salt Lake City. She's a proud wife and mother of 2 daughters, and also serves as the assistant director of the Deborah Bonner Unity Choir, gospel choir, who performed here 4 or 5 years ago. Were you part of that choir that day?
Just joined.
You had just joined it. Cool. Yeah. Well, that was a rocking good time, a rollicking good time, I guess, more than rock. I wanted to take this time to note too that of the 3 up here, Kimberly actually wrote an essay for a book that was just published earlier this year called Why I Stay, Volume 2. Bob Reese, hold it up there. That's what it looks like. Kurt Bench says he's got lots for sale. And when I saw her essay in there, and it was so beautifully written and wonderful, I said, hey, would you actually like to give this to a public audience rather than just have people read it? And she said yes for that. So I'm really thrilled that she's willing to do this. And I didn't even have to ask any extra people because all 3 of these said yes, and so I'm so grateful for them. At the end of this, if there's any time, we can take questions from the audience. For those of you who are watching online, or for those of you who don't get up here, please write your questions on the app, the Sunstone app, and we'll see if these folks here will address you directly through the comments and notes there. So thanks so much. We are turning it over to Blaire. Yay!
Kidding. So first of all, I'm flattered I was even asked to be on the panel. I didn't know I was Why I Stay material. So super flattered to be here. For me, I just have to clarify at first, especially as being a queer Latter-day Saint, that this is just my experience and it's not used as a template or as a suggestion to tell any other queer person how to live their life. It's our job to love queer people and let them live the life they need to live. But with that being said, I take a very non-binary approach to Mormonism and to church participation and how I choose to engage with my culture and heritage. So I joke that while I'm on the Why I Stay panel, I could also be on the Why I Leave panel because it's the same and both at the same time. For me, in a lot of ways, I have both stayed and left, and neither left or stayed. So I will share with you some brief thoughts I wrote down, and I like to leave lots of room for Q&A because it's way more fun to hear what you guys want to hear about than just me talking at you. I am not an ex-Mormon, a post-Mormon, a Jack Mormon, a progressive Mormon, a TBM Mormon, nor am I your average Latter-day Saint. I am should I be here? Like that?
Try to get both.
Oh, okay. Try to get both. Never been asked that before. Nor am I your average Latter-day Saint. I am a queer Mormon. Though I don't attend church or the temple, I am still a queer Mormon. It is simply because it is unsafe for me to worship in a queer hostile environment. However, that doesn't mean I'm not Mormon. It means I value my mental health and safety more than conforming to other people's expectations of Mormon orthopraxy. Mormonism is my culture, heritage, worldview, and yes, it is my religion. I still have Mormon values predicated on my Mormon beliefs and testimony. My Mormon theology is still my theology. It's how I'm oriented in the world. It's how I view my earthly purpose. And for this, I am often told by ex-Mormons and post-Mormons that I have Stockholm Syndrome and that I'm brainwashed by my abuser, because a lot of times queer Mormons don't get the luxury of being trusted in our own experience. However, I also believe that institutions need to be held accountable for their sins and trespasses. I believe in a Mormonism bigger than what's presently being taught in most Latter-day Saint settings. I believe authority should be shared. I believe in the redemption and repentance of my people, my faith, and yes, my church. For this, a lot of active Latter-day Saints see me as a wolf in sheep's clothing or a lost soul deceived by Satan, because, again, queer Mormons often don't get the luxury of being trusted in our own experiences. My relationship with Mormonism is not exclusively dictated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Like most identity labels, I am Mormon because that's who I am on the inside. I do not owe anyone an explanation or performance that conforms to their ideas of what an ex-Mormon or a Latter-day Saint should look, act, sound, or be like. My relationship with the church is different than my relationship with Mormonism. My relationship with the church is much like my gender. It's non-binary. I am both in and out of the church, or neither in and out of the church. I do not conform to binary narratives of active or inactive. Yes, I haven't been to the church regularly in years, but I'm most certainly active in Mormon discourse, worship, communities, and academia. I am a queer Mormon, not just because my gender and sexual orientation are queer, but because queer Mormonism is how I experience Mormonism. It doesn't fit neatly into preordained categories. I don't see Mormonism as a silo I'm in or out of. I am not in Mormonism. Mormonism is in me. Mormonism is woven into the fabric of my being beyond warp or weft. My Mormonism is not fine linen. My Mormonism is a rag rug. It's colorful scraps of fabric bound together by practical necessity and love. And that, too, is pretty damn Mormon. So, for me, my approach to Mormonism and why I stay has very much been wrapped up in, even if I wanted to leave Mormonism, I would still be Mormon. There is no leaving for me in the sense that it's so deeply and intimately part of who I am. I cannot forsake it any more than I would my gender or my sexual orientation or my pronouns. It's just part of who I am. And so I stay not because, yes, in a weird way I kind of have to. It's something I have to reconcile and work with, but also because I want to. It's still deeply a part of who I am, and it's still part of what I love. And I don't feel like I should have to give up the things I love because things got queer. Thank you.
Oh, do you want to do Q&A now?
If anyone has
I didn't
Q&A
know how.
questions for Blaire, she has 10 more minutes of her time.
Yay.
So,
Okay, I just didn't know which order because I
please
love
come up to
leaving
the mic
tons of
if you want to
Q&A.
talk to,
Yeah, Q&A is way more fun. Yay.
Hi, I wrote this question down. I'm a card-holding Latter-day Saint, and I wanted to thank you for your recent book. It was an answered prayer. I'm a person who chooses to stay because I am the change that I want to see, and I want to be the change I want to see, and I want to protect people who are on the margins. So my question is, how do you reconcile, or what advice would you have for people like me to reconcile the desire to change and what that might do to people who are harmed by my participation or activity in the church? I heard you say something like, I don't know anyone in explanation. Is that what you would say, or could you expand on that?
So, depending on the situation, so let me see if I just make sure I get your question correctly. Like, what kind of advice would I give to someone who's changing to, or staying to be the change they want to see, but not want to hurt anyone else in the process of doing that?
Yes.
Okay. So first and foremost, I'm a big fan of put on your own oxygen mask before you help assist anyone else around you. I can't do the work I do unless I can breathe. And that came a lot from personal revelation. Like, Mormonism has this weird relationship with, like, what is the ultimate standard of knowing and the ultimate standard of truth. And in the scriptures we read, there's no greater understanding than a personal witness from the Spirit. So I really like that. It can be weaponized in a lot of ways too, but I really like that because it centers it on internalizing, recognizing what's right for me, and helping me be able to put on that oxygen mask. And that's why I participate the way I participate. This is what makes me feel good. Once I was able to do that and be okay with me and what's going on, it all of a sudden becomes a lot easier to help other people in the process. Because I'm already comfortable with me, I'm okay with me, and I know that the way I engage in Mormonism is going to make other people uncomfortable, but knowing I'm comfortable with me is a great start. With helping, being the change you want to see, I really think that it needs to come from a place of it's helping you too. Anecdotal situations that I've been in a lot is it can be difficult when you have a queer loved one, and that queer loved one is very much disaffected with the church, and they're no longer wanting to engage in that. But then, whoever else is still very much engaged, and that is the trickiest part of being able to be okay with difference. Like, we're not really okay. Sometimes we're not really okay with sitting with difference. Like, we tend to grapple with the in or out, the active, the inactive, wrong and right, and all these things instead of grappling with difference. So that would be the next thing, to learn to be okay with difference and reconciling that with maybe loved ones. The other thing I would say is, I love the stay and be the change you want to see. It is absolutely fantastic and noble work, and at the same time, it's always okay to take a break. It's always okay to go out to your car and have a little, Diet Coke, whatever you need to get you through the day. For me, how I came to this kind of like approach for me is I was attending regularly, and without giving too much of a backstory, I had basically I came out a while ago. I mean, but it was a while ago, and I was very much ostracized from my ward for that, and I was released from my calling. I was not allowed to work with the youth or children or anything like that, and I was still going to church and wanting to make this work. And it got so bad that I started having panic attacks at church, and I'd have to leave church and go have a panic attack in my car. And there's this one Sunday, someone said something aggressively homophobic. Like, it wasn't just like, oh, the brethren, and it wasn't. It was aggressive. And I had to leave, and I went out to my car, and I was having a panic attack, and this is where personal revelation comes in. I had the most profound personal revelation from my heavenly parents that said, Blaire, it's okay not to be here right now. We know your heart. We know what you're going through. You don't have to put yourself in an unsafe situation. And I just got this really peaceful experience that was like, look, you can't do the work we have planned for you if you can't breathe. So there's more to Mormonism than sitting in a pew every Sunday. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent and probably a little off base. But the biggest thing would be personal revelation, and go with that. Make sure you're taking care of yourself, and also take breaks whenever you need it. Whenever you need it. It's totally okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, so thanks for your comments. Mm-hmm. And as you were talking about having this non-binary approach to your, Mormon worship and engagement, that made me think of how, I think Sunstone as an organization, to me, seems to have this kind of non-binary approach of, it's not for ex-Mormons, it's not only for ex-Mormons, not only for committed believing Mormons, it's for all kinds of Mormons all over the spectrum, all from different sects. So I'm just wondering, does that track with your experience with Sunstone? And also, what other spaces in, Mormon discourse and Mormon community have you found that are, friendly to this kind of non-binary engagement of you don't have to be in this one particular group in order to participate?
Yeah, okay. First of all, 110%. I'm wearing my little Sunstone More Than One Way to Mormon pin. Mm-hmm. It is, I'm biased, but it's the best catchphrase Sunstone has ever came up with. Yeah, definitely More Than One Way to Mormon, and Sunstone is easily one of those havens where you get to come be the kind of Mormon you are. You get to come be a polygamist. You get to come be a queer Mormon. You get to come be whatever you get to be greeted at the table as you are. So definitely. The trick is finding those other spaces too, right? And again, this is something I take literally on a case-by-case basis. So I also get asked to speak a lot to a stake presidency will be having a hard time, and they'll ask me to come speak and with them in a private setting and things like that, which is funny because once you stop attending church, all of a sudden they want your feedback and things, and I'm like, this is so weird, but anyway, we'll go with it. And so I was asked by a friend to have me come speak with the stake presidency and their wives. And I'm in this situation talking about my non-binary approach to Mormonism and everything. And you just see minds exploding, just not necessarily even comprehending how that would even work, because it's tricky to ostracize someone who we have a lot of shared foundational beliefs and things like that. But at the same time, I'm wearing this, and they're I don't know what to do with that. You know what I mean? I don't know what to do. But for me, that turned out to be a very positive experience up until a certain point. And when things got a little too antagonistic and a little bit of gaslighting going on and things like that, that's when I am saying, okay, well, thank you for your time. I'm glad that hopefully this was helpful for you, and I learned a lot from this engagement, and you're not my whole night. So, you move on and do other things too. So for me, it's really a case-by-case basis. Sometimes I'll go to the ward trunk or treat And then sometimes I won't. I'll really just do what I want to do when it comes to the church. It's there for me, not the other way around. That's it.
If you have a question, we'll hopefully have some time, and if it's for Blaire, you can ask that then. But Jay, questions for Blaire? Well, there's some themes that have come up in what I've written that are kind of cool. I like the rag rug thing, because mine's about a variety of threads that have come up. I really appreciate being here, and I'm grateful for all of you being here. I'm touched. There's Natasha. So thank you. Thank you so much. You know, yesterday I was asked by a friend, oh, by the way, I guess I'm the token old white straight guy, aren't I? I didn't realize that one. That's kind of cool. That's that rug thing, you know. We got all these colors and things going on. So anyway, yesterday I was asked by a friend, and I just happened to run into, what things hold me to the church? What one thing holds me to the church? And I couldn't come up with just one. Why I stay engaged with God, Jesus, Revelation, and the Latter-day Saint faith is a cord woven from diverse strands of ideas and experiences. Reasons that have been carefully curated over many years. Together, they hold me in this close proximity to the church, but more importantly, a more proximate divine love for all of my fellow creatures. Some of these reasons for belief are found through rationally inexplicable experiences that we call miracles. Others have come from toil in the trenches of service with fellow saints with and without the church. Some from my years of exploring and journaling Scripture. Some from other wisdom traditions. Some from prayer and fasting. A few from desperate pleadings in the temple. Others from history, science, and secularism. Some from spending time with the spiritually wise, Dan and others. And others from spending time with the worldly woolly. Many have come from the meek, and even more inherited from my time spent trail running on this beautiful planet that we call Earth. My trust in this way of being, trusting in a God who somehow reveals to all in a variety of unique and organic evolutionary ways, has taken me to remarkable places and people. Places like this and people like you. It has enabled me to stay fully engaged in the church. But key to why I stay is why I left some strands of beliefs along the way. Hopefully, the experiences that I share will illustrate both of these whys. I was adopted as a newborn by two converts to the church who met at church during the service project. I was their only child. They were beautiful and remarkable in the most important ways, ways that continue to be strands that I hold on to. They gifted me with great love and were true examples of thoughtful, ethical, compassionate behavior. Orthodox believers, they sacrificed much time and resources to grow the church despite having very little materially. After spending my middle school years in rural Utah, we moved back to Oregon to a little logging fishing town where being Mormon was peculiar. It became the most important part of my identity. Nearly my entire social life, let alone my family and personal life, were immersed in my religion, and I was respected from many because of it. The branch was my extended family, and some remain like family to this day. It was in the first month of my mission that I experienced a crisis of faith. My companion took me to visit an 11-year-old member at the hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan. As we entered the room, I was shocked to see what seemed to be a living skeleton. A girl sitting on the top of her bed, bald, white, with arms hugging her knees, rocking backwards and forwards, weeping. I left that room forever changed and disturbed. What kind of a God lets this happen to an innocent child? For the next week, I troubled and prayed over this. The possible explanations that came to me were these. There is no God. There is a God who wound up the world and walked away. This is a game to a God who enjoys seeing suffering and injustice or does not comprehend what those are. Or, as I was taught and was fortunate
fortunate enough to experience through my parents, God consists of loving heavenly parents who want and need me to keep wondering about suffering and injustice and try to alleviate it. I chose this last belief, maybe, if for no other reason, because it was what I wanted and hoped to be true. It still is. To stay in belief, I had to doubt there was a God and then consider God's character. I had to make a rational choice to believe in a particular kind of God and existence. I had to leave my naive certainty about God at the door of doubt and faith. I still struggle with what Elder Renlund called in his most recent conference talk, infuriating unfairness. And even at times, I still struggle with the belief in a God, let alone a church of God. This was my first reasoned approach to staying, but there were also miraculous threads that led me to stay. Experiences that I've been unable to dismiss despite my attempts to secularize them. In the last month of my mission, I had the good fortune to train a fresh, guileless elder. Despite having trained many other missionaries, this elder schooled me in the meek and miraculous. Within a week of his arriving, Elder Jensen told me of a Tongan missionary who would, while fasting and praying, be led to find people who were trying to be taught. Sorry. I always have a problem with this, sorry. He wanted to try this. We lived in a rural area with bicycles to get around. Despite my fear of us failing, I let him lead this entire venture because I had faith in his faith. Near the end of our 24 hours of fasting, we left our apartment. We prayed at each crossroad and then headed the direction that Elder Jensen felt prompted to go. Many miles later, we stopped in front of a highway, no houses in sight, and while trying to discern which way to go, the driver of a Camaro waved as he turned onto a dirt road across from us. We followed. Several miles later, a Jeep Cherokee came up to us and stopped. It was the same man who had been in the Camaro. He was excited to see us and began talking to my companion as if he knew him. He gave us his address and sent us on a visit to his wife. When she answered the door, she too began speaking to Elder Jensen as if she knew him. We learned that this family had just moved to Michigan from Ohio. They had been taking the discussions there, and one of the missionaries looked and sounded just like my companion. They were delighted to resume being taught. It is hard for me to imagine that this entire encounter was a series of random coincidences. Before and during my mission, I struggled with feeling unworthy and inadequate. My mission president and many of my experiences did much to give me confidence and alleviate these feelings, but part of it was just my personality. At one of our baptisms, I was asked to speak on the Holy Ghost. After giving my remarks, which seemed to me very unremarkable, I berated myself for such a poor offering for such a dear friend. Those feelings and thoughts weighed on me as we laid our hands upon her head. As a member of the ward commanded her to receive the Holy Ghost, I was jolted out of my self-pity by the sensation of a strong physical current running through me. It wasn't painful, nor was it pleasant, but its presence filled me with tremendous comfort and gratitude. I simply felt loved as I was, despite my inadequacies. How to explain this experience? I was not seeking a spiritual encounter or confirmation, nor was my mind attentive to the words of the meaning of the moment. Afterwards, I asked a member from that circle if he had felt something similar. He had. I have no secular explanation for it. At the time, I counted it as evidence that the church was true. But now I see it as a manifestation of God's great, unearned, undeserved love, what we call grace. It has been a significant reason why I stay, and a significant reason why I was able to leave some of my future doubts and feelings of unworthiness behind. My marriage to Jane 6 months after my mission entailed another leaving that let me stay. On our second date, I discovered that she was a widow, still sealed to her first husband. I learned that this sealing had caused her heartache after he had passed, because several suitors had not been able to reconcile not being sealed to her. I did not want to injure her, and I told her that I would study, fast, and pray about this before we went any further. By the time she returned from visiting family in Idaho, I had my answer. despite finding nothing in the teachings of the prophets to give me any hope for full celestial glory. The God I had come to believe in would not withhold blessings from anyone seeking to do good. This was not an epiphany, just common sense. Three months later, we were married for time only in the temple. The wedding went poorly from beginning to end, especially for Jane, it being the second marriage where her non-member parents and siblings were excluded. Jane and I birthed 2 boys and adopted a 3-year-old girl. She remains to this day unsealed because it would have been confusing to be sealed to a father she never knew. Our boys were automatically sealed to Jane and Bart through their marriage sealing. Years later, a more detailed recounting of our story wound up in Carol Lynn Pearson's book, Ghosts of Eternal Polygamy. It wasn't until this seminal work that Jane and I even connected our sealing issues to patriarchy and polygamy. So I have stayed by leaving the orthodoxy of eternal marriages, sealings, and celestial glories, while still appreciating and believing in this essential critical nature of healthy families, a belief of lives of love everlasting, regardless of who it is with or the ceremony of how it is done. How we love is what makes love last. Attending the temple increasingly became more uncomfortable for Jane, while it became increasingly more valuable to me as I attended with a friend once a week for a year. I've had several profound spiritual moments of revelation in the temple which brought me peace and hope during some of my most difficult times. One was during a particularly challenging period of our marriage. I contemplated the possibility that Jane might leave, thereby losing her, the house I'd worked so hard on, and the family life that I cherished. As I shared the pains of my soul in prayer, a powerful thought and feeling came over me that felt directly from God. It was this: yes, I could lose everything I loved and valued in life, my wife, my children, my home, my job, even my health. But I would never lose God's love and care. I would be okay. This revelation continues to help me bear my burdens and others with more charity and less fear and defensiveness. One day during this difficult period, I was at work feeling discouraged about my capacity to change enough to salvage my marriage. A friend of Jane and mine called, who I hadn't seen or spoken to for some time. Not of our faith, she said she had just been praying and felt impressed to call me and share some personal struggles within her marriage. Her sharing helped me realize that there was more to our marital problems than just my behavior. It gave me perspective, greater compassion for Jane and myself, and the capacity to be more long-suffering. Was the temple revelation my own desperate creation? Was that phone call just another coincidence? Could be. But to me, such conclusions seem irrational. Again, a godly love and care had been manifest. The teen years were very difficult for all in our family. Each one of our children had unique challenges, and the church helped and hurt them in different ways. Much of the hurt likely came from my earnest overzealousness to keep my wife and children on what we now call the covenant path. And there were times when my temper became a tool to hurt them rather than letting my love lead them. Despite our kids being raised in a loving home where we did our best to check off all the important church boxes, our 2 boys and their wives became atheists. Not only that, 3 of them are anarcho-capitalists. That is capitalism without any government. Our bisexual daughter leans liberal Democrat and has dabbled in Buddhism. They are all idealists in different ways, yet we share most of the same ideals and dreams. Our middle son, Ben, didn't leave the church until a year after his mission. His girlfriend, now wife, was an immigrant from Italy whom he met in a singles ward. She left about the same time. Ben was our only child who had ever strongly believed, and he left in great anger with us and the church. He felt deceived and harmed by it. The repair of our relationship with him came with its own series of miracles, born out of the unconditional love that Jesus kept pointing us to. Aaron, our oldest, has been with his common-law wife for over 13 years. She, too, was once active and once even wanted to serve a mission. He met her at a strip club where she was working as a pole dancer. After giving us 2 amazing grandchildren, she returned to her profession, because she enjoys it. Lexi is a wonderful mother, and Aaron a wonderful father. Well, eventually the patriarchy, opaqueness, and strangeness of the temple, along with polygamy, racism, the misjudging and exclusion of our LGBTQ friends, and other issues led my wife Jane to resign from the church in April 2019. I wasn't surprised and fully supported her, since I share most of her concerns and frustrations. And Jane continues to be the wonderful partner, mother, and friend to many. Our kids and their spouses are compassionate, generous, and thoughtful to us and others. They are fiercely independent, resilient, and productive. We are a more unified family than we've ever been. I love them all dearly and do not fret about their salvation. Their leaving has helped me be a much better Latter-day Saint, Christian and human. In 2011, I began praying earnestly for ways to help the less fortunate. About that time, we became friends through a church calling with a Mitchell Spence. He invited me to a discussion group called Think Again that he and his wife, Tiffany Ivins, hosted in their home. There, we met thoughtful, curious people who explored interesting and important topics. One of them invited us to a small gathering to learn about a nonprofit now called the Bountiful Children's Foundation. There we met Bob Reese, one of its founders. He became a dear friend and mentor, sharing his wisdom and offering me opportunities I had not imagined. His friendship, his story, his creation of this very forum, Why I Stay, is another reason why I stay. Well, Michelle and Tiffany eventually moved, and Think Again members Mark and Dawn in England began hosting it at their home, Mark being the son of the beloved Eugene England. Around early 2013, I was asked by the leader of the Think Again group if I would be willing to take it over. Not long after, I asked a couple of friends from my current and previous ward to lead a discussion about Mormon history and faith crisis. Our usual number of participants swelled from 12 to over 80. It was a powerful evening of frank and open discussion and a space of love and acceptance. Afterwards, Dawn suggested we have an additional monthly group about difficult church issues. Reluctantly, I agreed, feeling inadequate to facilitate such a forum. Initially, I leaned on my kind, newfound friend, Dan Wotherspoon, for connections to speakers. Since then, I have had many prominent Mormon scholars and thinkers lead discussions, as well as artists, poets, humanitarians, former pastors, active bishops, and even my neighbor, the rabbi. I've been touched by the good-seeking hearts of those who attend and those who present. It has been a beautiful experience to be, I believe, led by God into a foreign land of learning and ministering that I never imagined. Faith Again has been another important part of why I stay, even as it has been helpful as some have left. Parallel to my inside work on the outside edge of the church, I have continued to be tutored by my activity in the center. I have been blessed to be part of several baptisms that came through home teaching assignments, people I'd come to love and become friends with. One was a baptism of a young former gang member, another a struggling single mom with addictions. I saw over time how the gospel and the saints who loved these converts changed their lives for the better. I journeyed with a neighbor whose daughter was a longtime alcoholic and saw her break that addiction through reading the Book of Mormon and the ministering of LDS missionaries while in jail. I saw leaders take extraordinary time and interest in some of the most desperate and injured people, nurturing them into a better place. I continue to see the church and its members spend enormous time and resources helping refugees through my service in an African refugee branch the past 6 years. So I stay because I see the church slowly evolving in important ways regarding race, LGBTQ issues, and women's equality. I stay because they have become much more transparent with their history. I stay because the church creates service and community among the different. I stay because I am seeing the church love better. None of this is fast or far enough for my taste, but neither is my own reformation. I stay because Jane and I continue to be enriched by our relationships with all kinds of Latter-day Saints, though I have left believing that God wants everyone to be a Latter-day Saint. I stay because I believe I am part of a church that has the best institutional bones and resources to solve violent conflict, poverty, climate change, addictions, depression, othering, and this current destructive divisiveness, if enough of us stay to help flesh it out. Not all can, not all should. At the end of the day, I stay because I feel called to help the church and me become the change I believe God wants to see. Thank you.
I gotta say, I forgot until the moment Dan said that I could just read this thing that I wrote like a long time ago. Like, I had seriously forgot. Which is fine because I have it right here, but I'm glad I can do that. I'm really grateful to be here. Sometimes I think I have this thing where I walk into these Mormon spaces and I'm like, oh, like, here are all these white people and stuff. And I kind of feel like a fraud, or because it really, I am, and I know Sunstone's like more than one way to Mormon or whatever, but like they favor the like more diverse brands of Mormon, and I'm like pretty orthodox, I think, except for being black. So if you're disappointed, I'm sorry. I will share one thing before I get into this, and I guess I was just reflecting on how I even got here. So I went to the temple yesterday for the first time in a couple years. I was pregnant and used that as an excuse, and then, la corona. But so that means I missed like a lot of big changes in the temple in that like 2 or 3 year span. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like so exciting to me. Like, I only have to like change this one time, and I'm just really confused. And then I like of course I arrived late because CP time. So I'm in the back and I'm waiting for everybody else to go through. And I was thinking about this covenant that I made to use my time and talents to build the kingdom. And when I think about how I got picked up to do this Why I Stay essay, it was really one of the more random circumstances in my life where I was with Ronnie Jo Draper at BYU, a place I said I would never be, let alone work, trying to convince a bunch of B school students that racism exists. Like, just like I've had many moments where I kind of wake up and I'm like, what is my life from what I thought it would be? And then from that, the professor that invited us said, oh yeah, by the way, there's this essay project. And I'm like, okay, sure, I'll like submit something to this. And it ended up being just a beautiful part of my summer and a time to reflect. And so I'm grateful for the ways, strange as it may be, that I've been devoted in my life to trying to build the kingdom in the ways that I can. The other thing that I was kind of distracted by in the temple, like while I was waiting, I looked down at my hands and I'm just like, man, like these are some black hands. Like you can see like the ash in them. And it, as strange as it is, because I just got through saying, like, I'm very acutely aware that I often enter spaces with many white people, and surely that day I went to Bountiful and I'm like, so many white people. But like sometimes I don't look at myself in context, and so I'm just like, wow, this is weird. Like, this is what everybody sees when they look at me, and kind of having a weird existential moment of what's it all mean. But when I think about the things that I'm able to do in the church because of the perspectives I have as a black woman and all the other things that I am, I really got to give it up to God, because I couldn't have come up with this myself, like in any other body or any other spirit. So, all right, I'm going to read this thing now. It's called Lessons from My Grandma's House. My grandma Melba was the greatest woman in the world. My mom was great too, but she didn't spoil me like Grandma did. Side note, my daughter is with my parents now in North Carolina, and she has been for a month, and so I guess spoiling is in the grandma genes, because my mom would never do what my daughter's Gigi is doing. But anyways, Melba was a superstar. She taught for over 40 years in Greene County, North Carolina, where nearly everybody knew her. She was always classy, never rowdy, and wherever she went, people were always chasing her down to say hello, give a thank you for a service she had provided, or just to share a laugh. She was active in the community and held the respect of everyone, from the humblest farmer to the local bourgeois. As important as she was in the eyes of others, in her eyes, her grandchildren were the only ones, besides the Lord, who were worthy to be praised. My father was her only child, and so she could devote a lot of energy into being our biggest fan in the twilight of her life. Whenever I performed a musical number, crossed an academic threshold, or achieved some honor, she always made a proud yet heartfelt scene, often standing up and dancing in celebration. It didn't really matter where it was either, like, you just stand up. Anyways, our usual Sunday routine involved arriving 3 minutes late for church, but being right on time for the Sunday repast at Grandma Melba's house afterward. We'd stay through the evening, gorging ourselves on fried chicken and cabbage, and finishing off with Edwards brand strawberry cheesecake and Lorna Doone cookies while surfing channels on her satellite TV. We rarely talked about why it was that we didn't spend the morning at church together like many extended families we knew. We were mostly just grateful that the hour and a half she spent at her African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church gave her enough time to get back home and prepare the meal while we slogged through our 3-hour Mormon church block. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been the only faith home I've ever known. The story goes that my mom first spoke to the elders on the deck outside our house because my father wasn't home at the time. They were out tracting, but she invited them back to teach our family. My mom and my oldest brother were the first to get baptized in 1990, and my mom will never let my dad forget this, when I was 2 years old and my older brother was 4. My dad held out for several more sets of missionaries until finally taking the plunge 2 years later. As far as I know, Grandma Melba never criticized my dad's decision to join the church. I don't even remember her talking about how odd it was that besides us that there were no black families at our church. I do remember that Grandma Melba's house was the place where I learned the most about what it meant to be black. I can still remember her kind-hearted laugh followed by her sharp correction when I asked if she was white because she had lighter skin than I did. She taught me about the civil rights contemporaries of her day, and at her house we watched many black historical movies that kids our age probably had little business watching. Grandma also demonstrated the expansiveness of the black family. Her house was the anchor of the family farm where her younger brother lived and her youngest sister came as faithfully every Sunday as we did. She and my other grandmother were great friends, and she even hosted my mother's siblings for occasional dinners. Her love extended to our church family, even though she wasn't a member. She often joined us in the pews and politely greeted our teachers and friends. She was a faithful woman, doing what it took to keep our family together. The hours we spent at my grandmother's house are countless, but as I reflect on the question of why I stay, 2 instances keep replaying in my mind. The first is from my junior year of high school. My brother and I were home for Christmas, he from college and I from the residential magnet school I had just begun attending. I sat in the coveted leather rocking chair, marveling that we could watch the Mormon Tabernacle Choir Christmas special on BYU TV on my grandma's satellite network all the way in North Carolina. My family was gathered around watching the choir's special. They were singing Bethlehemu, and we were wondering why Alex Boyer, whose face we always eagerly sought out in the sea of white faces, didn't sing the solo in the Nigerian song. As the camera panned back over the choir, all of a sudden I found my eyes glued to the screen, thinking I was witnessing an earthquake in Salt Lake City. I gasped and then realized that it was not, in fact, an earthquake, but rather the usually stoic choir subtly swaying to the African beat. I don't know if y'all ever seen this, but it takes me out every time. I doubled over laughing, amused at the awkwardness of the choir's attempted cultural crossover. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my grandmother also seemingly shaking with laughter, only to realize quickly, as my father rushed over to her, that she was having a seizure related to an illness, pancreatic cancer, found 2 months earlier in that beautiful dancing body, an illness I had only recently learned about at that time and barely understood. At that time, Grandma had enough up days with her downs that I thought she would come through, just as she had everything else in her life. In some ways, we were lucky to be away during those times because we didn't see how much she suffered. But it made her death a couple months after that Christmas even more shocking. The other important memory at my grandma's house was from 2 or 3 years earlier when I was still in middle school. My dad was in the rocking chair this time while my grandma and I sat on her red patterned sofa. 2 missionaries from our church were sitting across from us on a matching love seat. They had been coming over to Grandma's house for a few weeks now, and I was thrilled at the prospect of having her join us regularly in the pew where my immediate family had been sitting for the past 10 years. Other family members had taken the discussions before, but they had all been too Baptist to trade in their shiny halos for greenhorns, as the Southern Convention went. But I was sure that my grandmother was going to make it to the water and be baptized. I don't remember much of the discussion that took place that day, but I do recall Grandma asking my dad some very pointed questions about a certain doctrine that differed from what she believed, and my dad was doing his best to respond. I've never asked him about the moment that came next, maybe because it was too painful for both of us. Perhaps he had been anticipating her question and had feared it would come to this moment, because when she asked, he blurted out the answer to get it over with. At any rate, as the conversation ensued, my ears perked up to this gem of a non sequitur. Well, my dad said, matter-of-factly, there was a time when blacks couldn't hold the priesthood. From that moment on, everything around me moved in slow motion, while thoughts pulsed through my head at the speed of light. I remember looking down at my own brown-skinned arms, then past them to the blood-red carpet underneath, then up ahead at the curio stand in the corner that held my grandma's treasures, a Best Teacher Award, her large print Holy Bible in triple combination, and pictures of my brother and me. The wicker basket columns holding up the glass shelves blended in with the wooden bars that formed a trellis separating the den from the kitchen. In that moment, those bars formed my mind's prison, blocking the synapses that were attempting to fire from my brain to my feet to get me to run and be anywhere other than in my skin in that room in that moment. The last thing I dared to look at was my dear grandmother, the greatest woman in the world, shaking her head furiously and decisively with her eyes closed. I won't, Ricky, she told my father. I won't hear any more. I started to come back from this to my own personal hell, my mind most clearly grabbing hold of one thought to ground me. Why did he tell her? Why did he tell her that now? And so it's so interesting to reflect on that, being my first conscious response back then. So I wrote this in 2020, and at that time the world felt like it was on fire. So it says, my husband, our 2 little girls, and I have been in our spacious but seemingly ever-shrinking apartment in Salt Lake City for the better part of 3 months. Thank goodness we moved. But anyway, trying to keep ourselves from contracting a virus that appears to be most severely impacting the heavenly melanated among us. My heart's in a constant prayer for my angel parents who live 2,000 miles away and are continuing their work as healthcare providers to vulnerable populations. Within the last few weeks, just as people have been getting anxious for their lives to get back to normal, the news of Ahmaud Arbery came to light, a young man black like me, killed by 2 white vigilantes while out jogging. Since then, the names of other black individuals taken from us before their time have risen to the top of an ever-increasing list written on my soul. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks. The names swirl around me as I think about being trapped in that room with my grandma, who was also taken before her time, in part by the same social determinants of health that make the current virus more fatal to black and brown communities. And the one aspect of the scene that I can't remember as clearly as this week of the leather chair my father awkwardly shifted in, or the laser beam light reflecting off the curio shelves from the lamp framing my grandmother's face, or the darkness in the kitchen behind it, which matched the darkness of my despair in that moment. is the missionaries who were sitting right across from me. I can't remember them because they were silent. As silent back then as the church I love has been to condemn the racism of today. Now, after that they did release this statement, but whatever. So when I reflect on the milk toast. When I reflect on these things, I feel a bit of shame at my teenage naivete to think that my first reaction was to be angry at my father instead of more reactionary to the system we were both caught in. I wish I could blame it on being a kid, but by that age I was pretty savvy as to how the world worked. Though I had never heard the term intersectionality, I had already put together that to be young and smart was one thing. To be young, gifted, and black, as my dad once quoted to me from the old Nina Simone song, was quite another entirely. To be a young, smart, black girl added different complexities. And to be a young, smart, black Mormon girl in the South provided enough challenges to make my head spin. Still, I had always felt up to the challenge, especially when it came to defending my faith. I played the part of Molly Mormon as best I could, memorizing scriptures, filling my quote box with lines from obscure general authorities who were gone long before my time, learning to play deep-cut EFY tracks on the piano, and watching On the Way Home and the touch of the master's hand so often that the tape on the VHS wore thin. I did what I was taught and then some, feasting on the words of Christ, trying to stave off that gnawing feeling of being out of place, desperately nurturing the belief that the gospel works for everyone. Up until that day, with Grandma and the missionaries, I thought my family was the only black family in the fuse because of good old-fashioned Southern racism, not because of the church's own history with racial issues. Even if I didn't feel like I belonged to the church belonged to me. And that was more than enough reason to love it as unconditionally as I did. Other than the pain of my grandmother's refusal to join the church, I didn't think much about what had happened that Sunday afternoon, at least not consciously, and tried to live my life in denial of what I had learned at her house that day. As I look back now, though, I realize that this event may have laid the foundation for much of how I think about my membership in the church today, toward the development of guiding principles that have shaped my spirituality up to the present. Oh, okay, I'm not done. I can remember being in my high school library around the time my grandma was taking the missionary discussions. The library was probably just as much a sacred space for me as church was at the time. And I was browsing my favorite teen magazine when I came across an article about a special school in New York City named after a man named Harvey Milk. It described the school as a place open only to kids who identified as gay, bisexual, or transgender, so they could go to school without being harassed or harmed. Now, growing up fairly deep in the Bible Belt, I had never dreamed of going to New York City, had never heard of Harvey Milk, and didn't know any gay people. But as my big little heart poured over the pages, something deep within me was touched by the idea of a place where people who were different from others could go to be safe, and I felt a desire to go there one day. Whether it was to visit, volunteer, or work, I wanted to do anything that would help those kids know that they deserved to feel safe and deserved to belong. Well, I didn't have the chance to fulfill that dream, though it's still on my bucket list. It was the beginning of my conscious desire to both commune with people who had been pushed to the margins of society and to empower marginalized people to carve out their identities and create their narratives, both flowing with and coursing against the dominant culture. Most of my current work as a psychologist and advocate began to take shape in that small library. Another pivotal moment from this time happened when one of my high school drama teachers announced that she was organizing a school choir to sing black gospel music. The only exposure I had to gospel music at that point was whatever played on the radio during the 8-minute ride to church, or on the rare occasions that we would visit the Baptist church where my mother grew up. I can remember being a little girl bracing myself against the hard wooden pews and trying to hide my head so that the cacophony around me would lessen. My favorite primary song at that point was Reverence's Love. So it was especially hard for me to understand why these people were doing so much rocking and clapping to the music in church. I'd look over at my mom and be somewhat disoriented when I saw her singing something other than what came from the green book I was used to at my church. But I also remember noticing, even as a child, how much like a child she looked when she was singing those songs, almost as though she was in her safe place. So when the school gospel choir started up, I joined immediately. The best way to explain how significant that particular decision was is to fast forward almost 15 years. It's 2018, and I'm sitting in the most unlikely of places, part of a 350-person choir at 10 o'clock in the evening, with the iconic bright golden organ pipes of the church's conference center behind me, as I'm watching the Empress of Soul, Gladys Knight, pace back and forth nervously on the stage beneath me. She's surrounded by musicians and numerous amplification devices and monitors to help send the sound back to the choir. We're preparing for the B1 celebration, the 40th anniversary, commemorating the lifting of the priesthood and temple ban for black people. But in that moment, we were running into the problem of producing a gospel sound in a building that wasn't made for that type of music, or any music really, but anyway. The musicians waited patiently as the sound engineer adjusted the knobs, then tested their individual instruments as he instructed. In the moments of stillness, the musicians began to improvise on their instruments, eventually morphing into a song I had heard years ago. I should sing this, but I often joke because I spend so much time around the Bonner family that I'm like the 9th Bonner that doesn't sing, so I will not sing. Jesus, be a fence all around me every day. Jesus, I want you to protect me as I travel along the way. I mouthed the words softly and let my eyes droop, almost as my mother did in the pews of Beautiful Valley Free Will Baptist Church. I was contentedly resting in this daydream when a white woman next to me asked, "Do you all sing this song in your choir?" Yes, the B1 choir was intended to be a symbol of unity, don't get me started on this, but was in fact a Transformer-esque mashup of different choirs and singers from across the country, including the Deborah Bonner Unity Gospel Choir, which I was a part of, the predominantly Polynesian Divine Heritage Choir, and Gladys's own Saints Unified Voices. The singer addressing me was in the already colloquially branded Tab Choir and was not familiar with the song, but she apparently noticed that several other voices around us had joined in with me. "No, it's just one that I know." "So where did you learn it?" I paused for a moment before responding. "I'm not sure exactly, but as black people in the church, you have to pick this stuff up from somewhere, or else you don't have anything to talk to other black people about." And so it was. When I joined that little gospel choir in high school, oh, the kids stared. It was probably the blackest thing I had participated in at that point, and I felt like all the real black kids there knew it. It wasn't that I wasn't black, but I had little cultural capital in the black community for various reasons, being Mormon the biggest of them all. There were many black churches in our town, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints wasn't one of them. I didn't know the songs the other kids knew. I wasn't used to moving as the other kids moved. And when I felt the Spirit, I didn't sway and bounce and run with my head to the sky like the other kids did. I was acutely aware of being a stranger in my own land. But when I heard gospel music, when I joined my voices with my peers, I felt the kinship of the ancestors join us all in a way that was so intoxicating to me that I couldn't give it up. I learned from participating in that group how to have the courage to bring other experiences in, to feed my soul as the Spirit dictated to me, and that this Spirit does not belong to one religious denomination. I felt that I had found something that I didn't know I had lost. I'm seeing how much more I have to read. Not too much more. How much time do I have? None.
Well, you're about right, but
Okay.
there's still 15 minutes left in the session.
Oh, okay. Well, I won't take the whole
So,
book.
this is sort of great.
All right. I wish that I could say that I found a secret reservoir of the balm of Gilead to make the wounded whole, or that I had a heavenly visitation to soothe my anguish, and that those were the things that helped me find the strength to keep the faith through the years. However, our Mormon stories tell us, perhaps better than most traditions, that even angels can't shield you from the pain and consequences of life. There have been many painful years I've spent fruitlessly engaged in the actions of apologetics and ecumenicalism, seemingly to no avail, with my Southern Christian cousins. Many years defending my career aspirations to my white in-laws and busybody ward members, even as it sometimes caused strain in my own marriage to dream differently than the typical Mormon girl. Many years following the desires of my heart to be an ally to my LGBTQ siblings, while dodging the leadership roulette that makes same-sex advocacy okay one day and verboten the next. Even within the safe spaces of the gospel, I sometimes struggle to feel comfortable, because my skin often doesn't have that Mormon glow of whiteness that people, at least in this country, have come to associate with the church. As I write this, I'm listening to my husband explain the nuances of systemic racism to an old friend, and my tired bones thank him. He's a bishop right now and recently sent an email to the ward about the need for people with white privilege, as he holds, to reflect inwardly and repent of the sin of racism. As woke as he can be, and as nice as it is to borrow his privilege on occasion, it doesn't change that our relationship is a consequence of the radical acceptance during my teenage years that I would likely have to marry a white man in order to raise children in the church. I assume that my fellow members must recognize this on some unconscious level, but it's never stopped anyone from either leaning in too insensitively, asking me, "How did you find the gospel?" without asking my husband the same question, or ignoring the complexity altogether. So one time I went to the state fair, and this genealogy lady said, "Give me your maiden name so I can look up where your ancestors came from," not realizing that they're actually looking up the family history of my ancestors' oppressors. It also doesn't change the level of intimacy that I reserve for issues of race, that my husband doesn't always have the experiences to empathize with or the skills to respond without intellectualization or defense. Also troublesome for me was the conflict of my soul over the policy of exclusion of 2015, when I saw many white cisgender LGBTQ allies leave the church, exclaiming this was the worst thing the organization had ever done. If this was you, I forgive you, but... Had their proximity to privilege made them blind to the embedding, blooming, and weaving of racism into church culture, even with the shared experiences of marginalization? As the black pioneer James said, "Is there no blessing for me? Is there no room for me in their conceptualization of justice?" In other words, at the end of the day, I'm still black. I've still felt the weight of proving that I represent the church I fought so hard for my entire life. After weeks of pondering the question of why I say it, an adage I use frequently in my profession with therapy clients comes to mind. It's rarely effective to ask yourself why, because you're usually looking for reasons to be hard on yourself or wish you did something different. I suppose when I look at it, the events in my journey thus far in the church are full of the kind of scenarios that would leave and have left many people bolting for the door. There's an improbability to the whys we tell ourselves, so that our stories of resistance and resilience go even taller. A large part of my story of staying hinges on reframing those improbabilities into inevitabilities of discipleship. I once remarked to a friend in the gay LDS intersection that even though he had moved on to other faith communities, everything he did seemed to be distinctively Mormon, from the way he talked to the way he said his passions. He responded with one of the wisest phrases I've heard: "Mormonism is my native tongue of faith. To really communicate what I mean in that very delicate intersection of intellect and spirit, of course, I'm going to express it in my native language." I realized that this same spirit had guided me through many of the trying times of my life, maintaining the comfort through the discomfort and giving me a place to belong. The last thing I talk about, well, no, maybe I'll leave it so you can buy the book from Brother Bench back there. But the end of this is basically me saying what I expressed earlier, that I could not have created the life that God has carved out for me. And when I look at how things have come together, I want to stay with Him. I want to stay with my Savior. I want to stay with my heavenly parents. And that's what helps me to stay in the church. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, guys.
We have about 9 minutes for some Q&A, so just direct it to whoever you like, and we'll make them take the route.
Okay, my question is directed to all three of you equally. Please imagine that sometime next week you get a phone call from church headquarters, and the spokeswoman says that the First Presidency of the church has heard your Why I Stay speech and recognizes there's gaps, weaknesses in their administration, and they, building upon what you've said, they ask to have lunch with you. In fact, it's the whole quorum of the 12 as well. They're going to keep quiet. They have a yellow pad in front of them, and they want you just to share. So my question is, mention, based on your topics, what can the church improve? do better? What should they stop doing right away and never do again? And time permitting, what's really strong?
That's a crazy long question to answer.
I need a week for the
How about we each try one or two? If you have,
Okay.
limit yourself to what first comes
Yeah.
to mind.
Or what's really strong? What does the church do super well that you want to compliment them on? Consider that.
I guess my first response is like, well, if you read, what else do you want to know? That's enough. Don't bleed my soul. I did a dialogue Sunday school a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things I talked about, like from my perspective as a therapist, what I had asked people to do was to think about, like, I always start with an ACT value sort so I can help set goals for clients. And so it's just like a list of words, like qualities that like stand out to you, and you're supposed to pick the ones that like you feel like you're oriented by. And so I asked people to do this for the church and for the gospel and for themselves. And what I think that helps me do is say, like, when people were doing this for the church, they were coming up with things like order, obedience, faith, love, not acceptance. Nobody said that. But, like, just all of these things, when you look at the history of the church in context, like, that stuff makes sense, right? Like, it made sense for them to want to have a sense of order, togetherness, like predictability, when they felt like they were running for their safety. So I have a lot of empathy for that. But then when we look at what the values of Christ are, they kind of feel different in some ways, not in the ways of order or even love, but just that I think most of us would perceive Christ to have a better sense of this dialectic of acceptance and change. And so probably a lot of what I would say to them is along that lines. One of the big reasons why I stay in the church is, and I think I've heard that from what they've said as well, is that I have so much hope in what we could be. Like, I have a lot of faith in this eternal set of values that we're all just like trying to fumble and get close to and align ourselves with. And if we could get there, then we would be in a good place. And so just a sense of compassion for where like we have been, but also like that urgency to do something different than what we're doing so we can live up to the full measure of what God knows we can be.
Specifically, I'll talk specifically towards queer issues. There's a lot of things that I could talk about right now. But the first thing would be to just say, shh, please just stop talking about all things queer. Just stop talking. Because it would just be damage control at this point with the impact that it's had on, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, all these things are like a lived reality. So I would just say, hey, just if you could just stop talking for a minute, that would be like really helpful. The next would be education. Just a whole lot of education, experts in the field, and personal experiences and things like that, and recognizing, there's still a lot that you need to learn about the queer experience, which isn't even just one experience, it's very broad. The next thing after that would be, okay, so if you recognize, like, your scenario is wonderful, because, like, yes, we want to change. Well, thank goodness. It would start to be to actually have queer inclusive policies where queer people actually can participate. There are actual, policies and things in place that are saying, no, you actually can't enter this space. You cannot go to this thing. You cannot. It would be to eliminate those barriers and being able to create a more queer inclusive space to do that. Now, that I do want to recognize, I'm like going really fast because I don't have a ton of time. I do want to recognize that we are also a global and international church, and so there are places in the world where my existence is illegal. You know what I mean? So recognizing the complexities that would come with that. But the number one thing I would just ask the brethren right now is to stop talking. Just stop talking about all queer issues and go read my book.
Yeah, just real quick, I would say very similar. Just listen. Just listen to the members. Sorry, I'm kind of talk. Just ask them to listen more. You know, in general conference, just have a bunch of people come, like that come to faith again and think again, and have them talk and say, we're troubled about these things, and just listen. Just spend a lot of time listening. So I like the premise here that they would even invite in your question, that they would even, and I think they do. The challenge I see is that they are trying to hold a huge diverse culture. I mean, we've got the progressive liberals on one side that are screaming at them, you guys are so slow in moving in so many vital areas, and then they've got, you know, orthodox conservatives that are just screaming, you guys, what are you doing? You know, this is not what we were taught. You're the history, what's all this stuff going on? Why are you accepting, you know, how's LGBTQ stuff a choice? All these things. So they're trying to hold a huge space. I would hate to be them. So I have some empathy for where they are, partly because of my own personal experience and where I've shifted. But I do think just in general, as our culture, we just talk too damn much and listen too little. And so I would hope that we could be better at listening, particularly to the people on the margins.
We are nearing our end time. I guess we're actually at it. Kurt Bench, do you have Queer Mormon Theology at your tables too? We do. Good. So Blaire's book, the Why I Stay 2 book is right there. We're right out the door this time. And what a wonderful 90 minutes we've spent together. What beautiful souls that shared peeks into who they are with us all. I know I'm enriched. I know all of them to a little bit of a degree, but boy, this is so gorgeous. And if anybody isn't moved by what we heard today, I don't know, whatever. So we've all been a little bit, let's do a real round of applause before you head to your next session. Yeah.